Well, welcome to the podcast. We're back from summer vacation, apparently. But what is it Amanda says? Podcasters take summer breaks.
They do, yeah.
So we took a summer
We
break.
did.
One of us has been traveling internationally to Iceland and went to a big fly conference in Reno, Nevada for, was it a week?
A week, yeah. First time it's been held in the United States. So that was exciting.
Yeah,
It travels the world.
And you said that in 4 years' time, it's going to be in Croatia.
That's right. Yeah.
I can't name a city in Croatia, I'm afraid. So I don't know where that would be.
I don't remember the name of the city, but they did say it.
Oh, that's cool. That's cool. So we were talking, you would think that after an entire summer, we'd have plenty to talk about. I know that when we left, we had been talking about fallacies and problems, but we thought we'd just bring you up to date with some of the things we've been working on and some of those issues. One thing that Amanda and I were talking about before the podcast were doing manuscript reviews, and I don't think we've talked about that process.
We have not
online. No. Do you want to give them an overview of how the system works?
Sure. So when scientists conduct research, they generally publish that research. And actually some people's jobs are dependent on publishing
like
that
all
research.
Of it, like guys like me.
So you submit, you write it all up and you submit it to a journal. Usually the journal has something specific to do with what you're researching. So we would not submit our things to a engineering journal, for example. So then there's an editor. The editor reviews it, does it meet the requirements of this journal, and then sends it to reviewers. And there has been a little bit of change in the last couple of years with reviewers. There's what you can have like double blind, where the authors don't know and the reviewers don't know. So like nobody knows anything about it except you just see the paper, but nobody knows anybody that's involved. You can have single blind, where the reviewers know the authors, but the authors don't know the reviewers. And then you can have completely open, where everybody knows everybody that's involved. So reviewers are people like us, just people in the scientific community who have some level of expertise in that area. We don't get paid for it. It's part of our scientific duty.
Do you know that I have been paid as a reviewer? If I reviewed for the Arab Gulf Journal of Research, and I believe they paid me, if you can believe this, $500.
That's
and it was dirty, destroy the planet oil money. But you know what I discovered? It's spent the same way as clean money.
Oh yeah.
nobody noticed the pollution dripping off those bills. Off the check.
Okay, well, generally people do not get paid for reviewing. It's just part of being in the scientific community.
The other thing nobody believes is that you don't get paid for publishing. You pay them to publish.
Yes, there's page charges, there's color photograph charges, and then
you can even get editorial charges if you have big changes in the proof stage.
Yep, in the proof stage.
You can build for that.
Yeah, so the reviewers read through it and decide if it is worthwhile scientifically, if it has good materials and methods, if the science was conducted well, if it makes sense, if it adds to the knowledge in that scientific area. And you can have a couple of different choices, right? You can accept with no changes, which means it just gets accepted as is. The authors don't get it back and they don't have to change anything.
So rare.
You can have minor revisions, which are usually like some grammatical errors. You can have accepted with major revisions, where they want you to rework like a whole section or move things around or maybe add some more data if you have it. And then you can have rejected. If it gets rejected, you can rewrite it and resubmit it to a different journal. And try your chances with potentially different reviewers. And then it gets published, sometimes right away online, sometimes 12 months later. in a paper journal. It just
Yeah.
depends. It depends on the journal. And then what I find most frustrating about it is that I would say most research conducted in the United States is probably taxpayer funded at some level, particularly if you're studying agricultural science, medical science. You know, you're getting funded by NIH, the National Institute of Health, or DOJ. So
Department of Justice.
Yeah, Department of Justice, National Institute of Justice, which is what helped fund my PhD. And those are all taxpayer funded science endeavors. When you publish that science that has been tax funded, you then would have to pay to read it because there's paywalls with all of these major publishing houses. And it can be what, $40 an article?
Easily,
up to
but yeah,
$80
easy,
an
40,
article.
$80 an article.
And
And
subscriptions to these journals are like $3,000 a year.
And so if you're in a developing country, it basically prevents you from seeing that aspect of scientific literature.
Or even just a poor grad student.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
It makes it really hard.
So we get our access through our institutions, but the institutions have to pay big bucks for those subscriptions. And the companies that do publishing are billion-dollar concerns. The whole academic publishing industry is a couple billion-dollar industry. And as Amanda says, it pretty much exists by taking taxpayer, whether it's US taxpayer, taxpayers in another country, their funded research, slapping a copyright on it, and then literally charging people for the right to access it. So there's a big movement called open access, which is the principle of publishing online and letting anybody read the papers. And so there are open access journals, and typically the way they fund themselves is that their page charges are higher. And I think there's a bit of a shakeup. There are a bunch of new publishers. Some are called predatory publishers that have the reputation of publishing anything. And things of low quality. My own feeling about it is, if it's open access, the scientific community will decide whether what's out there is any good or not. Because if it's good, people will reference it, or as we say, cite it in their papers. And if it's bad, it'll die a well-deserved death from neglect. But I keep track of my own rejection rate, and my rejection rate, which is, let me just say that I'm very atypical of reviewers. Amanda can call me out on this, but my rejection rate's about 10%. I would say that of the papers I've seen, 90% are scientifically valid, and that's the criteria I use. I mean, as long as you can read them. I don't engage in a practice of saying, well, this isn't important enough, or this doesn't conform with whatever, so I'm going to reject it. And God knows I've been victim of that with my own papers, and it's infuriating to have a good paper. Amanda and I both have experienced this many times in our career. And so we tend to have a very jaded view of reviewers and people who manipulate the system to try to ensure that it's their papers or their points of view that are expressed and others are out there. So, but gosh, I was saying to Amanda that I thought I'd done a lot of reviews. I think I've done 5 or 6 so far this year, and I learned that she's done just as many. And a lot of it turns out both of us have been reviewing for open access journals. So it's part of our responsibility.
Yep. And we do try, us personally, we do try to publish in open access journals because we are so jaded, and we don't think that people should have to pay to access science, period, but then also science that they've already technically paid for in their taxes. So we sort of took a moral stance, right?
The biggest problem that we have is there's certain journals we should publish in that are not open access. And the reason I say we should publish in them, it might be we go to a meeting, we deliver a paper, we deliver an oral presentation, and then we're going to submit the written paper. Well, as part of the deal for the oral presentation, they want us to give them sort of first refusal. Journal of Forensic Sciences like that.
I think if you present and publish within 6 months of the presentation, you're supposed to publish with the journal of the conference you were at.
Yeah.
So,
but they're behind a paywall, which I
yeah,
find infuriating.
yes.
And it's one of the things that makes me so angry about this is that there's a lot of lip service given to being inclusive in science and respecting minorities and so forth. But if you want to talk about respect of minorities, excluding the entire third world from your papers and from access to science because it's behind a paywall, I can't imagine what's more discriminatory than that. And yet, like my own scientific society, the Entomological Society of America, I was on a panel that pleaded for open access for our journals, and those pleas went unanswered. So our stuff is behind a paywall, and I've just stopped publishing there because yeah, I don't know. The journals have better reputations. They're widely read, but I can't bring myself morally to go along with it. I feel like I need to make a stand and publish in open access wherever I can.
Yeah, the system is not without major flaws, but it is currently the only system we have.
Yeah, and
to
part
regulate what's being published.
Peer review is problematic because it's difficult to. There's so many papers. It's difficult to get good reviews. You're asking a lot of people to do those. It's pretty easily manipulated, and I've served as an editor for 3 different journals, an associate editor. So I've seen from the side of an author and also the side of an editor some of the way people try to manipulate the system, and so there's a lot I dislike about peer review. But the alternative is like fake news on the internet. The alternative is disastrous. With peer review, we have not a guarantee that stuff is true, but we'd like to think that it presents a check, so the worst things are excluded. It's not always true, but
and if something gets published that turns out to be let's say one of the authors falsified data or made untrue statements in their paper, those papers are retracted by the journal. The problem is that it's not always easy to tell when a paper's been retracted, particularly if you had downloaded, if you had access and you had downloaded a copy of that paper before it was retracted, you don't get a notification or anything that paper has been retracted. And so there is a lot of work that needs to be done in our peer review process.
Yeah, the other thing about it is not all papers are created equal. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of kind of subtle ways that things can be. I don't even want to be cynical and call it cheating, but there's a lot of ways errors can perpetuate. If somebody says something that's wrong, the next person comes along and cites that paper as a certain fact being true, and then somebody comes along and cites the second person. It doesn't take very long before something can be presented as or factual, whereas if you go back and look at the original paper, you'd say, well, look, the data are really weak for this. It was never that strong. And so that is what I would call the scholarly part of science. The original research part is doing research and experiments and so forth. The scholarship part is when you look at published research, you go back and evaluate whether you think it's true or how strong you think the evidence is. Amanda's development studies are a good example. There are with the insects she looked at for development times, there are other papers on development, but they have 100th.
Yeah,
I'd say 100th of the amount of data that Amanda does. And there were deficiencies in those studies, such things as, the sampling time. If you're looking at when, as the insect's growing, what's the interval you look at to see if it's made a stage transition? Well, Amanda did that 20 times for the insects, 20 different intervals for the insects she's looking at, where somebody else might do them for a day or something crazy.
Or looking at a single temperature.
Yeah.
Or destructive sampling versus not destructive sampling.
So when you go to the literature and say, oh, well, so-and-so says this is the development time, whereas Rowe and Higley claim the development time is blah, blah, blah. Well, you're comparing, to some degree, you're comparing apples and oranges, because the Rowe and Higley study, speaking now egotistically, when we have 100 times the data and a lot better, you're not comparing the same thing. You should be, you have to look at studies and see what the weight of the evidence is, and you can give those, you should, give those maybe some priority. And so there's a real, I think, art to doing the scholarship and interpreting data and trying to see how your results fit with somebody else's results. And I would say much more than experimental problems, that's one of the biggest deficiencies I would see when people write, is that they maybe don't properly put their work in the context.
Or they don't find original sources. We find that a lot in forensic entomology, actually. A lot of assumptions are treated as fact because they've been cited so many times for so long. And then when you go back to the original citation, it'll be in French. And you know for a fact that not everybody who is citing that paper speaks or reads fluent French. And so there's a lot of assumptions that are made, particularly in our area. A really good one that I would like to spend some time researching, and I have some ideas, is there is an assumption that blowflies will come from 5 miles to a decomposing animal. Where
does that number come from?
Where do we get 5 miles?
Nobody. I guarantee there's zero studies to support.
There's not,
that.
and I have looked and looked and looked at the literature that is out there, going back as far as I can, and I can't find anywhere where someone actually tested that. So it's things like that where, so you'll find multiple papers where they'll say insects can fly 2 to 5 miles.
A classic way this would work is that someone would make a statement about that, and they would cite it as personal communication, which is wild ass guess. Is what you might just as well call that.
Or they saw it once.
Oh yeah. They claim they saw it once, and that counts. And
there is some legitimate personal communications, though, because
sure there are.
There are some times where so we actually just submitted and got a paper accepted from data that we looked at in 2012. So sometimes the wheels of science can move slowly.
All the time.
And so there's sometimes where there'll be someone who has a really large knowledge base about a certain topic, but they've never gotten around to publishing that data. So there are some legitimate uses of personal communications, but yes, a lot of times it's just like, we need a citation for this statement. That's
personal communication is one of those warning signs that you look at closely when you're doing a review to make sure that it's a legitimate thing. I saw the maggot emerge from such and such a location, personal communication. Okay, you actually watched it, and it was an observation you made versus something
that
else.
Actually that's a really good segue for me, because I have been really sad when it comes to reading papers, because when you read particularly entomology papers, and particularly papers about flies, things that were published from the 1950s and earlier are like reading a story.
Oh.
They're beautiful. They're elegant. They're easy to read. It's easily accessible. You would have to, you could understand the basic concepts of what they're talking about with very little expertise, I would say. Papers now can be a drudgery to get through.
It is a philosophical thing about whether a paper should be a story or a report, and reports are horrible to read.
Horrible, and I want to get back to stories so bad.
And one of the reasons they went to reports was a question of length and cost of publication. But now that we're doing online papers, who cares how long it is within reason? It's not that hard to tell a story, but it does require good writing skills.
It does, yes. It absolutely
And
does.
I think that's probably the biggest problem, is that people just don't, either aren't trained to do it, and then don't have the ability, or don't cultivate. Maybe the way I should say it is don't cultivate, because it's a learned skill.
It is. Yeah.
So yeah, I completely agree with you. Well, on a positive note, I started telling Amanda about this too before we began recording. I recently reviewed a paper on a, and I can't talk about the paper per se. I can talk in general terms, but because it's not published and it's not my work, I shouldn't, give away too many details. But the paper was just superb. It was so good. As I said to Amanda, it was without question one of the very best insect development studies I'd ever read. And it was one where I got to click that accept without change box. It was so good.
Hardly ever happens.
This is like the teacher thing. When we're grading, what do we want to find? Do we want to be a harsh grader and find all those bad papers? No. I want everybody to get an A+, because it's so much easier to grade perfect papers than it is papers with a ton of mistakes. Yeah. And so it's the same way with manuscript reviews. But this was on a really fascinating species that I didn't know about, Chrysomya nigripes. I think I've got that specific name correct. And it comes to the body later. It comes during the bloat phase. So that would be like typically under warm temperatures, say 3 or 4 days after death. And so it would occupy a really interesting time for trying to determine postmortem interval. And one of the things this paper had that so impressed me is, besides just really detailed, comprehensive data sets on how long it takes this insect to develop and how you would use that to determine development, they had a case study at the end where they used it to solve, to do an actual homicide and see it report back what the time of death was. So it presented everything from theoretical stuff all the way over to practical use, which I thought was brilliant. Just brilliant. So you said that you'd done development studies as well, or what are the papers that you've been reviewing primarily?
Some development stuff, a lot of entomophagy papers, so insects as food, looking at rearing insects on different diets and assessing whether that makes them better food.
Do you know what species were they looking at? You remember?
Oh, all kinds. One was about grasshoppers. One was on crickets. One was on, multiple ones have been about mealworms, which are beetle larvae.
Well, the A&M group is working with soldier flies, right?
Yeah, but yeah, they do a lot of stratiomyid stuff. But I think most of theirs is like
that's animal feed.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, and that, which makes a lot more sense, actually.
Yeah, they're using stratiomyid. The larvae will eat pretty much anything. And so they use them to basically get rid of trash, non-plastic trash, like they're using it to get rid of any sort of organic waste, and then going and taking those larvae and recycling them as animal feed, I think is.
And here's a question I have. If you have, well, I know the answer to this question, that if you have shellfish allergies, you are likely to have allergies to insect proteins.
You can potentially, yeah. Because of the chitin.
When you feed through, do you lose those insect proteins? So if you're feeding chickens on an insect meal, do the chickens come out okay? They don't have any potential insect proteins?
I don't know.
I'd like to know the answer to that question. I mean, maybe it's a naive question. Maybe there's no chance that you pick something up through your diet. Maybe it's all broken down, but I guess I'm curious about how that works.
So you're saying if we feed chickens chitin-rich diets, and then if you as a human are eating a chicken,
is your diet chitin free?
Yeah. Can you potentially have an allergic reaction if you're allergic to shellfish?
I guess I'm assuming the chitin would just pass through. They don't have chitinases.
So. Yeah. I feel like you'd probably be okay with the chicken, because a lot of chickens eat insects just naturally.
I guess that's true.
So And I mean,
Well, allergies, I have lots of questions about allergy. I think that's one
Yeah.
of those immune issues that are hard to it's hard to figure out.
it is. It's interesting. I am interested in it from like bee venom,
Uh-huh.
because you have beekeepers that'll keep bees
Oh, yeah.
forever and never develop an allergic reaction. And then you'll have beekeepers that have been keeping bees for 30 years and then develop an allergic reaction. And then you have people that develop an allergy after the first time they're stung. It's a really
Well, it's the issue that if you have prolonged exposure to a low dose of a protein, you can develop an allergy.
because that is the definition of an allergy.
And at the same time,
You have to be exposed to something.
you can
first.
desensitize if you have an allergy by long-term exposure to low doses of the allergen.
Mhm.
So it feels like the same phenomenon. Exposure to low dose can either cause allergy or cure allergy,
Right.
or at least reduce the impact of allergy. And I'm sure that they aren't the same, that they are different, but how that works is a real mystery to me.
Mhm.
And I actually asked an allergist about that, and the only response I got was, "That's a really good question, Leon." So I'm not convinced they know why that dichotomy occurs.
I've even seen the articles about the increase in the meat allergy because of movement ticks.
Yeah, tell me about that.
Well, I don't know much about it. I just know that ticks are expanding their range. And because of that, they're coming into more contact with human beings. And the tick species that carries this protein that causes this meat allergy is coming into more contact with humans.
I'm looking for a pen because now I'm going to have to write this down. So this is one of those, we'll post a link. I don't know if I'm going to be able to find it, but is it Lone Star tick?
Yes.
Oh, good brain on Leon.
Yeah.
And
Let's
do
check.
you know what there's a name for that condition?
Yeah.
Is it it's not just the bite of the Lone Star tick. It's
alpha-gal syndrome.
Spell it.
Alpha-gal, GAL syndrome, AGS.
Okay.
So
I'll see if I can find an article on that and post a link, because I don't know much about it, but I am curious. And I would like to continue to be able to eat meat, because if I'm not supposed to be eating carbs and I can't eat meat, I'm in serious trouble. I'm starting to lose my dietary choices.
Yeah. It says many foods and products contain alpha-gal. Yeah. So
All right. But that is a northward range expansion for Lone Star tick, right?
Northward and westward, I believe.
Oh. I would have guessed east. So that's what I know.
Well,
On this topic of expansion, my former student and colleague Bob Peterson sent me a link to a report from, of all places,
yeah. North and west.
North and west. Sent me a link to a report of 10 cases of dengue fever in Dade County in Florida.
That does not surprise me actually at all.
Well, it's been predicted, right?
Yeah, it has been.
And
it's Florida.
And it's
Why
Florida. Not? Of course it is. And apparently the vector is supposed to be Aedes aegypti, which is what you would also expect to be the potential vector. And the article says that it appears, if you're not familiar with dengue fever, it's a viral disease transmitted by mosquitoes that has the curious property of not conferring immunity after you have one case of it. There's different, there's immunologically different strains of dengue. And if you get one, not only does it not protect you from another, but the disease is actually much worse if you have a recurrent strain. The disease itself causes,
Breakbone fever, right?
high fever, terrible headaches. And then in its severe form, which is potentially lethal, you get what's called dengue hemorrhagic fever. And you don't, as a general principle, we don't want diseases with the word hemorrhagic, which talk about having unconstrained blood loss.
Yep. You bleed out of orifices.
Not good at all.
Not great.
Anyway,
and you feel like your bones are breaking.
And dengue is endemic to Central America. And there's been predictions that with climate change, as mosquito ranges expand, the insects that transmit this, like the famous Aedes aegypti, which used to be the yellow fever mosquito, they would expand their range, and we would see this. So I knew that parts of the Caribbean were having trouble with dengue, and apparently Cuba is one of those places. So the suspicion is that the mosquitoes made their way from Cuba, or individuals were in Cuba, got dengue, and then there was transmission, which there's a term for that when you have imported. Oh, you have a human who comes in, brings the mosquito-borne disease into a new place, and the local mosquitoes pick it up. And I have to apologize. I might have taught medical entomology at one point, but I've forgotten what that term is for that process. So what's the bottom line? Just as the Lone Star tick's expanding its range, the mosquitoes are expanding their range. New diseases are appearing.
Chagas disease.
In Texas, right?
And wasn't there, or maybe they found the red oviate in South Carolina? Wasn't there something?
South Carolina?
Yeah.
So Chagas disease is caused by, I believe it's a protozoan, right? Trypanosomiasis. It's called it's American trypanosomiasis, and the trypanosome makes its way generally to cardiac tissue, and if it doesn't kill you right away, it will gradually weaken cardiac tissue, and you can get an eventual cause of death from heart attack.
And how do you get it?
How do you get it? You get it from the bite. Actually, not from the bite. It's not the bite. You get it from a reduviid, a predaceous insect, assassin bug, that typically bites and feeds at you and around your mouth or around the eye. You know what that's called when they do that and it swells?
Lacrimal something.
It's called the sign of Romana.
Oh,
I do remember that from medical entomology. So you would think, oh, it's coming through the saliva. Nope, they poop
while they're feeding.
Because they have to clear their gut so they can take in more food. And if you scratch that feces, you'll infect the area where they've been feeding, and that's how there's a point of entry. It's called this is silly, a posterior station transmission, which so we don't say pooping, we don't say defecating or shit transmission. We say posterior station, which I thought a
lot of people wake up and freak out that there's a giant. Well, they're relatively big insects. I shouldn't say giant, they're pretty big. But they're pretty big. They freak out that there's a bug on their face, and then they go to wipe it off, and then they just wipe that poop right in that feeding opening.
It sounds like it would be an unusual disease. It's actually a very important disease. There have been it's endemic to South America, where there are roughly 20 million cases, and I guess I don't know what the fatality rate is currently from Chagas. If I were to guess, I would guess a few 100,000 people die. Maybe. Is it that high?
I'll look it up.
Chagas disease has occurred in the U.S. periodically, and if I remember correctly from my colleague Carl Reinhardt, I know historically Chagas occurred in southern Texas and along the Mexican border. There's archaeological evidence that it occurred. One of the reasons that we don't see it as much of a disease is it's not that common for Americans to come in contact with these. They're actually the subfamily of assassin bugs.
They occur pretty much in the entire the
triatome.
The bug itself. The vector.
It's in the subfamily of these guys is the Triatomini, And they're called kissing bugs for some reason. I
Because
suppose
because they
yeah, I
bugs,
don't know.
little sweethearts.
I don't know about that. But it's named Chagas disease for one of the earliest investigators on the disease.
Looking at the mortality, 10,000,
10,000 deaths globally.
up to 30% of infected people develops.
And the infection
That's
is
from the CDC.
And that's the infection's cryptic. And so it's one of those things that you can be infected and have it last a very long time. One of the things the trypanosomal diseases do that's really, really, what do I want to say, ingenious, is that you would think you'd form an immune reaction to them, which you do, except that they can change the proteins on the outer coat of the trypanosome. They'll shed those. So your body develops antibodies, but then the pathogen actually changes its spots, if you will.
No.
And so you can't get a vaccine or an immunological response. There are anti-trypanosomal drugs, though, that can help clear an infection. And I think I should know what they are, but I don't off the top of my head. But I'm putting
tropical entomology.
I'm not tropical insurance, but I am writing that down. So I'll post a link on Chagas, probably to the CDC site, because they'll have really current good information on that. So bottom line, all those climate change deniers, of course, are wrong. Hottest July on record for planet Earth.
Yeah.
And by the temperature was a third of a degree Fahrenheit warmer than usual. That sounds kind of trivial, but then NASA says that was a record. Most of the meteorological records are not a third of a degree. They're more like 100th of a degree. So it not only was it a record, but it was a record that was like 10 times higher, exponentially higher than what we usually see. And so the consequences of this, and biological consequences, which predicted 20-25 years ago, yeah, they're coming true as well. The disease expansion and these things are happening.
Yeah.
And so I don't know, I'm feeling like we should take out little full page ads in the New York Times that said, "We told you so, we told you so."
Was that every good horror movie starts with people not
listening
to a
That's right. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. Hey, that's not so bad. That's a pretty good place for us to close for today.
Yeah.
Every good horror movie begins with somebody not listening to a scientist. Okay, so hopefully we'll be back on a weekly schedule. I think we should come pretty close to that.
Mhm.
And so I'll get on my jobs here of doing those things, and we'll be talking to you later.
Yeah.
Bye.